In an age where we have all this incredible technology, how is it possible that a massive dam can just liquefy, or an entire mountainside can suddenly give way? We build these incredible structures relying on our instruments to be their nervous system. But what happens when that nervous system fails? Or even worse, what happens when we hear the warnings but just don't listen? Okay, let's get into this. This one sentence, it's just chillin', right? It's from an official investigation, and it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about. It tells us that these catastrophic failures, they aren't bolts from the blue. They're the end result. The result of warnings that were there, that were seen, but for whatever reason, they were dismissed.
And this brings us to a really fascinating new analysis from NEXGROW Academy. They dig into what they call a data paradox. And the idea is just so powerful. It argues that the biggest disasters usually don't happen because of a total lack of information. Nope, they happen when we are swimming in data. But there's a fundamental human failure to understand, to believe, and then to act on what the Earth is desperately trying to tell us.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll dive a little deeper into this data paradox. Then we're going to look at 3 really distinct patterns of failure, and each one has a tragic real-world story behind it. We'll cover what happens when warnings go unmeasured, when they're totally misunderstood, and when they are flat-out ignored. And then we'll finish up by looking at a blueprint for how to actually prevent this from happening again. All right, so our first pattern. This is, in a way, the most basic failure you can have. This is what happens when you don't even have the right instruments hooked up to hear the warning. You're essentially flying blind. The technical term for this is inadequate instrumentation. It just means the monitoring system itself is the problem. It's broken, it's not good enough, or maybe it's not even there at all. And the most heartbreaking example of this is the collapse of the Fundão Dam in Brazil. The consequences of this failure are, well, they're hard to even get your head around. Somewhere between 43 and 50 million cubic meters of toxic mining waste just roared down a river valley. To give you some perspective, that's enough toxic gunk to fill almost 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It was a complete environmental catastrophe. And beyond that unbelievable environmental damage, there was the human cost. 19 people lost their lives. An entire village, Bento Rodrigues, was literally wiped off the face of the earth, just buried under all that mud. It's a tragic reminder of what happens when the Earth's warnings go completely unheard. So what was the problem? Well, the dam was being monitored with these slow, really outdated sensors, and they were totally incapable of detecting a sudden spike in something called pore water pressure. Now, just think of this as water pressure building up inside the soil, pushing all the particles apart. If that pressure spikes really fast, solid ground can suddenly start acting like a liquid. It's called liquefaction. The engineers were completely blind because their tools just weren't up to the job. It was a classic false economy. They saved a little money on modern sensors, and it led to an infinitely more costly disaster. Okay, let's move on to our second pattern, and honestly, this one is even more unsettling in a way. This is when the instruments are working just fine, the data is coming in loud and clear, but the people looking at it just refuse to believe what it's telling them. This is what we call flawed interpretation. It's not a failure of tech, it's a failure of human judgment. It's when wishful thinking just completely overrules the hard evidence. And there is no more devastating example of this than the Vajont Dam disaster in Italy. At Vajont, the sheer scale of it all is just staggering. An entire chunk of a mountain, 270 million cubic meters of rock and dirt, slid at over 60 miles an hour into the dam's reservoir. Now, the dam itself, an incredible piece of engineering, it actually held. But as you'll see, that didn't matter one bit. That landslide created this massive wave, a tsunami hundreds of meters high that just went right over the top of the dam and completely obliterated the towns in the valley below. In an instant, about 2,000 people were killed. And here's the lesson from Vajont, and it's so important. Unlike at Fundão, the engineers had the data. Their instruments were showing crystal clear that the mountainside was moving. And not only that, the speed was accelerating, which is a textbook flashing red light sign of an impending collapse. But the team talked themselves into believing it would be a slow, manageable slide. It's a classic case of cognitive bias. They wanted the project to succeed so badly that it clouded how they saw the cold, hard facts. And now we get to the third, and in so many ways, the most infuriating pattern of failure. This is when the right tools are there, The data is interpreted correctly. The alarm is sounded loud and clear, but somebody in charge actively overrides it. This is called organizational disregard. It's not a failure of technology or even of interpretation. It's a failure of culture and it's a failure of courage. And the Nicoll Highway collapse in Singapore is the textbook example. So during the construction of this tunnel, they had thousands of sensors monitoring the excavation. And the data was not subtle at all. The instruments showed that the retaining walls were bending outwards by as much as 400 millimeters. That's more than 15 inches. Now get this, the preset alarm limit was only 150 millimeters. This was way, way beyond any safe limit. The system was basically screaming. But despite these incredibly clear, screaming warnings from the instruments, the contractor made the call to just keep digging. And of course, the inevitable happened. The whole support system failed, it triggered a massive cave-in, and 4 workers were killed. And here's the key takeaway. The system worked perfectly right up until that final human decision. The tech did its job, the warning was clear as day, but it was just ignored.
So let's just quickly recap these 3 patterns, right? At Fundão, the problem was unmeasured warnings. The tools just weren't good enough to even hear the danger. At Vajont, the warnings were misunderstood. The data was there, but wishful thinking got in the way of believing it. And at Nicoll Highway, the warnings were just plain ignored. The alarms were blaring, but they were silenced by the people in charge.
Now, these stories are absolute tragedies, but they give us a really clear blueprint for a safer future. So the big question is, how do we turn these painful lessons into a plan we can actually use?
Well, that NEXGROW article lays out 4 steps that should be non-negotiable. First, you have to install the right tools. No more of this false economy stuff. Second, you have to create and empower what are called Trigger Action Response Plans, or TARPs. Think of these as ironclad, pre-agreed rules. If a sensor hits a red line, this action happens. Period. No debate. Third, train your people to see beyond just the numbers on a screen, to see the patterns that signal a collapse is coming. And finally, and this is so critical, you have to foster a safety culture where anybody on the crew can stop the work based on the data without being afraid of getting in trouble.
At the end of the day, this is what it all boils down to. The technology is just step 1. The real challenge, the thing that could have saved lives at Vajont and Nicoll Highway, is building the human systems and the professional cultures that are ready not just to see the data, but to actually listen to it, and then have the courage to act.
And that really leaves us with this one big question. What all these cases teach us is that the Earth very rarely fails without giving us a warning. It whispers before it shouts. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, are we building projects and companies and cultures that are truly prepared to listen?